Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. This is the France 24 debate after the massacre and disappearance of student activists in the southern Mexican state of Guerrero. We're talking about it with reporter Johan Grillo, author of El Narco, Inside Mexico's Criminal Insurgency. He joins us from Mexico City. Here with us in the studio, Gaspar Estrada of the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po's Latin American Observatory. He's a visitor in Paris, visiting professor at Sciences Po and the Sorbonne. John Ackerman, who is columnist and editor-in-chief of the Mexican Law Review, and France 24's very own Eduardo Quay. Lots of reactions to this story coming in from viewers. Shuja saying the police can't be allowed to work like the mafia gangs they're fighting against. Now, after the murder of those students, France 24 went to Guerrero State. It's a report read by Julia Kim.
It's been 10 days they've been waiting here. At this rural university, the 43 missing students had been training to be school teachers. Their families hold on to one hope, that their loved ones are not amongst the 28 bodies found in the mass grave last weekend.
I can't anymore. I want my son to come back. I want him alive like I left him. I don't want justice. I don't want anything but my son. He really helped me at home.
This free school, where the poorest students study, has a strong tradition of social activism. Intimidation from local authorities is not rare, but it's hard to imagine how things could have spiraled so quickly out of control. These two students saw everything. They stayed hidden between two buses and heard their classmates cry out for help.
They made them get off the bus, nearly all of them, and they led them to their pickups. They protested and asked to be let go. They said they were just students. The police told them to shut up. They said they didn't have the right to speak, and then they fired at them.
10 days after these events, the Army and National Police Force were deployed to Iguala to replace the local authorities, which have had their ranks infiltrated by organized crime. But the situation remains tense, and the population fears reprisals from the criminals.
Let me first ask you, John Ackerman. We see the relatives of those students who've disappeared in that report. Indigenous people, and as Johan was making the point at the beginning of the show, these are people who are really upwardly mobile, you might say.
Yes, of course. These kids who are students are leaders in their communities, training to be teachers in their communities. These are young kids who otherwise, if they didn't have this opportunity, would have had to migrate to the United States and work in downbeat jobs there. But here they're being formed and trained to work and support their families and their communities. But they are also the children, the kids who are most abandoned by public policies, both local and federal public policies, and even demonized in the media and by politics. And this is not just a local thing, but a
demonized in the media?
Demonized, yes, of course, because they're seen as rambunctious, critical of the system, and particularly of, for instance, these neoliberal reform programs that Enrique Peña Nieto has been passing recently. They've been leaders in the critique of the education reform, the energy reform. Guerrero, for decades, as I think Jan was mentioning, has been a seedbed for activism and resistance to these neoliberal policies.
Let me just ask Johan Grillo on that. Johan, how has the media been playing the story?
Well, with this situation with the teachers and the student teachers, there was a big education reform by Enrique Peña Nieto, which threatens particularly these teachers. What it does is it threatens their automatic right from these schools to jobs. And it also puts evaluation systems which they consider very harsh. For example, these teachers often come from communities where Spanish is the second language, and it's asking them questions on their ability to speak English, for example. So there's been a series of protests by them over the last 18 months, often blocking traffic and roads. And in that sense, they have been very demonized in some ways in the Mexican media. And a lot of people have been angry with those protests. Now, that could be part of this, why the drug cartel and the mayor thought they'd get away with this crime was they kind of saw these, oh, no one cares about these student teachers. Now, suddenly there's obviously been a reverse now that there's been this horrendous crime against them, and there's been a big national reaction. And obviously people are seeing these poor young students as being the victims, and as a very horrific thing has taken place.
And Johan, the chief of police and the mayor of the town, they've gone walkabout, it seems. What's going to happen to them?
Well, they're on the run. I think their careers are over, and if they're caught, they're going to look at jail sentences. But it's no taken they will be caught. I mean, we've seen there was one federal deputy in the neighboring state of Michoacan, and he was caught on a tape talking to a drug cartel leader. He went on the run, and he hasn't been caught for 2 years now. So, you know, maybe they'll be caught and spend some time in prison. Maybe they'll turn up dead, or maybe they will escape and not pay for these crimes.
Gaspar Estrada?
Yes, I totally agree with Johan Guerrero analysis. I think all those local authorities have been threatened by the organized crime, and today there's a generalized collapse of those local authorities due to what? To the money and to corruption.
There's a general collapse of the Mexican judicial system. Yeah. I mean, I don't think that the people demonstrating have any hope at all that justice will be done. I mean, certainly in the past it hasn't happened, and I don't see why it would happen now.
A general, hang on, that's a pretty strong statement. A general breakdown of the judicial system?
I think that the Mexican judicial system is, on the whole, generally corrupt. I think that can be said. It may seem like an excessive statement, but certainly, if not corrupt, then at least under the influence of these drug cartels. What judge is going to go up against these drug cartels? What prosecutor is going to do that? A lot of crimes in Mexico, as elsewhere, go unpunished, but particularly when it has to do with this kind of a situation.
John Ackerman?
There's another incident which is very important. On June 30th, 2 months ago, 3 months ago now, end of June, there was another massacre in which 21 youth were shot down in cold blood by the military.
This was 90 miles from Mexico City.
Well, it was 50 miles from where we're talking about basically the same region, but this time, but previously in June, it was in the state of Mexico, which is the state that Enrique Peña Nieto, today's president, used to be governor of. 21 kids were assassinated. Supposedly they were narcos. Supposedly they had kidnapped someone. This turns out to be wrong. The kidnapping was made up. It's a confusing story, but they were shot down in cold blood.
And they were shot down by who?
By the military. By the military. This is very important. Federal government. This just came out. Actually, it was totally covered up by the local media, by the local politicians, and by the federal government. It only came out because Associated Press did its own research on the story, and then there was a witness who came out recently, just a few weeks ago. And so the idea that somehow sending the military to Iguala, the soldiers, and is going to somehow solve this problem, and once again, the idea that it's just a local issue in the mountains of Guerrero, is wrong. The judicial system is corrupt, but we have to look directly at the executive too. We can't be, we're here. It's very easy to somehow imagine that the president of the country is going to save the situation. He said he's going to do it. But once again, if you look at the Mexican public opinion, very few people believe their president, and that's the center of the problem here. And very few people trust the political system. Mexico is going to need a more broad-based political transformation in which people start to actually trust politicians, in which we have elections which create presidents who have legitimacy and can reform the situation in order for this to be solved.
And I think that this brings up the issue. If you recall, during the last presidential election, there was a lot of talk that the PRI had changed.
Exactly.
The PRI, which was the longest...
which is the ruling party.
The party of the institutional revolution. Right?
The longest ruling party, continuous ruling party, 72 years, than anybody, the Soviet communists or Fidel Castro, anyone. And they were out of power for 12 years. And when they came back, there was this debate, oh, it's a new PRI, it's changed. Well, I think this I think that this situation is beginning to point out that maybe it hasn't changed that much. And it has been, it hasn't been debated too much because attention, and certainly outside of Mexico, has been focused on the economic reforms that, it must be said, are pretty courageous on the part of Peña Nieto. Now, if they will they actually be instituted, and will they actually lead to a more just country, it remains to be seen. But he has made those economic reforms, which others had not made. But the political system itself appears to be as corrupt now as it was then.
I think that the major switch between the previous government and this one is that they changed their communication strategy. They said not to talk about violence, not to talk about war on drugs, but about reforms. And in that way, it changed the way people see the country and the economy and the Mexico as a whole.
So the drug problem is still there, but talk about something else. Reaction on Facebook from Aditya saying the Mexican government should do its work. Again, the president, Enrique Peña Nieto, taking to the airwaves and pledging that he would do something about it. All right, the president saying that we have to find those responsible for these crimes, which are outrageous, painful, and unacceptable. Johan Grillo, I want to pick up on something that was mentioned a minute ago by John Ackerman, which was the case back in June, where it was government troops that did the shooting in a massacre. Is it a case like the one you described in Guerrero State, or is it a case of, well, federal troops which are meant to be soldiers, not law enforcement agents?
Well, this goes to a real fundamental problem in the violence that's been plaguing Mexico for the last 8 years, and also plagues other parts of Latin America. And we get into this kind of gray space between crime and between an armed conflict or a war. When you unleash 50,000 soldiers and federal police in these areas, they react to violence with violence. Now, we know now, and now the federal government have admitted in this case that the soldiers carried out a massacre, but there's many, many more cases. I mean, the soldiers, during 5 years of Calderon's administration, he ruled for 6, but during a 5-year period, they said they'd killed, by their own figures, they'd killed 2,000 people. Now, they said in every case they were resisting arrest, responding to fire, but none of those were really investigated very hard. So we get a very difficult problem is how do you deal with heavily armed drug cartels? And unfortunately, the undisciplined soldiers are not a very good way. But
and what we're seeing on that point, Johan, correct me if I'm wrong, is more and more of these so-called self-defense units, these local militias, if you will. How's that going?
Well, yeah, I was been covering that this year. That's a tremendous story as well. In the neighboring state of Michoacán, I mean, up to 10,000 people taking up Kalashnikovs and fighting a drug cartel. And also they're present in Guerrero. In fact, in Guerrero is one of the places they really started. And a group of them have gone to Iguala. And the communities, many of the families of the teachers are going to the self-defense squads, these vigilantes, and saying, you find our sons. We don't trust the police, but we trust you. And this, I mean, these are often well-meaning people, but again, a tremendous threat to the rule of law in Mexico and to how really normality can be reestablished.
Yeah, just to talk about that point, it's a very important one, the self-defense or the community policing forces in Guerrero, Michoacán. In and of themselves, they're not a threat. I wouldn't characterize it that way. I would say that they're actually, they bring hope that actually people are organizing themselves. Community policing is something very respectful and very important in the United States and in many parts of the world. The problem here is that the government hasn't found a way to sort of successfully work with the community policing. So, for instance, what they've done is the most important community policing leader in Guerrero and the most important community policing leader in Michoacán, Mireles in Michoacán and Nestor Salgado in Guerrero, are now behind bars. They've been jailed for their community policing activities because Nestor Salgado, for instance, is accused of having kidnapped, supposedly, a criminal that she had detained along with other community policing people. So you see this increasing separation and distrust between society and the state. And this is very explosive. That's the real problem. That's what's creating a real danger for the future in terms of either violent or political flare-ups. It's really important to bring back together the state and society. And that's going to be a real challenge going forward.
Gaspar, what was your reaction to the rise of these self-defense groups?
Well, I think it was a natural reaction. I don't know if it was natural, but I understood at the moment why those movements rise. Why? Because there's a lack of trust between the state and society, and there's a tremendous state of insecurity on those places. And as I said, people has nobody has. They don't have any faith to talk with, because if you go with the policemen, they're part of the mafia, and if you go to the mafia guys, they're linked with the political establishment. So it's a very vicious cycle.
Yeah. If the government cannot protect you, if the government cannot give you basic services, you eventually are going to try to do it yourself. I mean, this has happened elsewhere, and it's a very natural. It was a very natural thing to do. But of course, it goes against these vested interests, namely of the drug cartels and of the police and local government officials.
All right, now the good news for President Peña Nieto, and we can say there is good news here, the homicide rate in Mexico is down 12.5% last year. It's expected to drop further still in 2014. The bad news, of course, Mexico is still one of the world's 20 most violent nations with 19 murders per 100,000 people. There you see the numbers on the one hand, but also the number of killings per 100,000 people. Honduras and Guatemala, by the way, much worse. So Central America, a real problem. We'll talk about that in a moment. But the United Nations saying it's in their Office on Drugs and Crimes Global Study that it's not all about drug traffickers. Problems in the protection of the right of life in Mexico are due to various factors, including deficiencies in the legal system, which we mentioned, increased organized crime activity and drug trafficking, and unwillingness or lack of capacity of police and prosecutors to investigate, distrust in the judicial system by citizenry, and lack of accountability for violations. Now, in fairness to both President Peña Nieto and his predecessor, Felipe Calderon, Jan Grillo, they both tried to do something about it, but in the case of Calderon, you had more and more of a bloodbath. So how do you tackle it?
Well, one thing that I think needs to be looked at right now is reforming drug policy. The United Nations report is correct in saying drugs are not the only issue, but they are an extremely big part of this picture. Now, no one knows the exact numbers. It's an illegal drug industry, but White House studies find some $80 billion are spent every year by Americans on illegal drugs, including heroin, cocaine, crystal meth, and marijuana. And people think some $30 billion of that goes every year into Mexico to these cartels. Now, over 10 years, you're talking about $300 billion. Over 30 years, you're talking close to $1 trillion. This has a very big cumulative effect. The money goes to the most psychopathic, violent people. That's the logic of this. And it really destabilizes the country. Now, the United Nations has been a block to drug policy reform. We have to find a way solidly to stop that money going to these criminal groups, buying them guns and giving them money to corrupt police and soldiers.
All right, and on that point, Johan, when you see in the U.S. states like Colorado that legalize marijuana, is that helping?
That's a good step forward, I think, to find a way, if there's a market for marijuana in Colorado, if it could be done legally and that money can be taken out of the hands of drug cartels, that's a step forward, although it's a very, very big struggle. Now the rhetoric has really changed. The debate has changed. Even 5 years ago, everyone said that drug policy reform was a non-starter. Politicians were afraid to wade in. And there's been a very, very fast change in the debate. We need a change on the ground.
John Ackerman?
Just about those violence and homicide numbers. That graph you put up there, I'd look a little bit more carefully at it. You can't really compare Guatemala and Honduras to Mexico. There are entire regions of Mexico which are totally peaceful. You can go to the beach and hang out for years and never see a narco, right? But there are regions of the country which are just as or worse than Guatemala and Honduras. Look at Guerrero or Michoacan or Veracruz or Juarez beforehand. Now it's become a little bit better. Things are not, and also the level of violence is so high, 18,000 a year more or less of homicides, and kidnappings has actually gone up. The first year of Peña Nieto, the amount of kidnappings went up. So things are not getting better. We are at the same terrible level of institutional decay. And once again, we need a national reform in this area. There's been lots of reforms over the last year. Not only Peña Nieto, but all the parties got together and did energy reform, education reform, telecoms reform. We can talk about those. Most of them, from my perspective, are not great stuff. But one reform that was left out of all these reforms was corruption reform. One of the promises Peña Nieto made and one of the major demands of society was to have a significant anti-corruption reform. This has not happened. There's still some scapegoats going to jail here and there, an ex-governor here, a union leader there, but we haven't reached another step of actually talking about honest, transparent, democratic public administration in Mexico, and that's the real way forward in terms of combating the violence and the drugs as well.
And the other way forward, if I may say, I think, and it needs to be said as well, is that the problem in great part is in the United States. This is where the consumption takes place. And as long as this consumption continues, I don't know how you're going to get rid of this problem.
And on Twitter, Colleen saying the problem comes from further away than the frontiers. A final word on this.
I totally agree with that statement because, and I think that all the evolution of the debate on the drug policies, especially in Latin America, is very illustrating about this issue about drugs and corruptions and murders, because today more and more political leaders, not only in Mexico, such as former President Ernesto Zedillo, but also former President of Colombia and Brazil, Cesar Gaviria and Fernando Enrique Cardoso,
even Calderon
and even Calderon today are defending a reform, a world reform about the UN system and the UN
and the approach to drugs. Gaspar Estrada, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Eduardo Cue, John Ackerman, and Johan Grillo. Stay with us because Media Watch is next. Please. We say goodbye. Let's say hello to Olivia Salazar-Winspear.
Hi there.
So this issue that we've been talking about, and of course, the outrage that we've seen.
Absolutely. So Mexicans are on the streets in their thousands from the capital to provincial towns. They're organising themselves, of course, with social media. The hashtag is Ayotzinapa Somos Todos, which is, of course, very much a solidarity move. We are all representative of these missing students. What's interesting is that the second hashtag, the most used for these, is narcogobierno, which comes back to something that we've been saying in the debate. The government is too tied up with this drug trafficking issue, and people are criticising them for not doing enough about it, and Peña Nieto for not tackling what he said he would tackle 2 years ago. Now, we can see from the protests there's, it's solidarity, but it's also anger and real kind of outrage. This is a map of Mexico with, sadly, the death toll on it. We've got people posting photographs of the missing students and videos and evidence articles about protests that go from Oaxaca in the neighbouring state to Guerrero to Mexico City. Now, a lot of the Mexican press is underlining the political aspect of this. Of course, it's a very anti-governmental feeling in these protests. But also a member of the opposition, a politician from the opposition, went out to protest peacefully in solidarity for the students, and he was verbally and physically attacked, as you can see from the Excelsior newspaper. Now, this shows just how much anyone associated with the establishment is held in contempt by these people who are out on the streets. And this paper went as far as to say, La Jornada here, this is a crime of state. They even draw a parallel with the violent military repression of 1968, in which hundreds of people died, and said that the authorities are aiding and abetting a situation where kidnappings, deaths, and torture is actually a daily occurrence in Mexico. Now, in the international press, there's been more of a global view discussing the role of the US and, of course, this famous war on drugs that we're still talking about. Mexican-American researcher here, she says that this drug war, so-called drug war, is actually exacerbating the problem, that it hasn't done anything to lower the homicide rate, which is, of course, illustrated, as we've seen, by statistics which can be interpreted as you say, in very different ways. Of course, the statistics in Mexico don't tell you which homicides are linked to drug homicide, but there's been an alarming upward curve there, which would go to suggest, as some of these editorialists are saying, that the so-called war on drugs that George W. Bush said would be a major thing in his first mandate has been eclipsed by the war on terror.
All right, and we're going to continue to follow that. Olivia Salazar-Winspear, I want to thank you. I want to thank our panel and thank you for joining us here for the France 24 debate. As we're getting seated, we're still on tempo.
Exclusive.
Jose Manuel Barroso talks to France 24. As his mandate draws to an end, the European Commission President will assess his record at the helm of the EU. He will analyse the challenges for the new Juncker team and discuss the prospects for Europe.
Exclusive on France 24 and France24.com.